America is divided, almost like never before. In fact, over the course of the last century and a half, we've come close to this type of social split a few times, but with the debates and debacles on full display 24/7, inescapably in your face, thanks to the internet and social media, it seems like there may be no other answer for this country than to amicably separate, move out and get our own place. Put the family house up for sale, use what you make on it to start over, respectively. Mom and dad try to negotiate split custody of the kids. Who keeps the insurance? What do we do with the 401k? You gave her your grandmother's ring. She's keeping your last name. Hell, my ex-wife refused to give court-ordered visitation with my kids over a broken vacuum cleaner. Boy, listen, divorce can be hard. It's rarely amicable. But when we start getting pragmatic about it, is there another option? Look, I'm saying if you know the marriage is ending and you know that you can't fix it, or maybe you've just realized too much about the other person that you can't look past, and it's that you don't want to fix it. Look, you've got one life to live. And how much of that do you want to spend under the hood of a broken jalopy? Maybe it's time to look for a new car that has a warranty. Maybe you just trade in for an upgrade every few years. Look, I'm not being problematic. I'm saying the same for everybody. Hell, I'm probably speaking more to women than men right now. That's just the straight relationships. But why on earth do we even mate for life? It almost never works out. Even when it does, who the hell dies happy? Am I being cynical? I'm being pragmatic. The idea of pushing through a toxic relationship is church-based indoctrination, mostly. It's that monogamy mentality our grandparents were dumb enough to fall for. They talked our parents into it, even though, let's be honest, who has ever played by the rules, right? I mean, how many people do you know that you can say without a shadow of a doubt have held to their vows 100%? No. I've already broken down the annihilation of America's integrity. I've already laid out how our values are a joke, even to us, and our defense of those values, morals, and ideals are so cartooned and caricatured, even our bald-face offense is for entertainment purposes only. We're all tricked into these ideas of loyalty, with geographic pride exploited for patriotism, further exploited for nationalism, like fascist fan-wagoning. You know, the fair weather fans who hop on the winning team after enough people are on the support train. Like bandwagoning, but a lot more culty. Fan-wagoning. You see this so much in social media and the online world. We don't always realize why we do the things we do. We're just so eager to move on to the next dopamine kick. We want to win. We want to be on the winning team. We want to be right. We don't want to be left out. Moreover, we don't want to be, thank you, Kirk Cameron, left behind. So we partner up. We read the books and we watch the movies and we diddle our dumbass selves into dreamland, praying that one day our prince will come, or princess, or whatever floats your boat. Metaphorically speaking, of course, unity, coming together. Individuals stronger together, bonded. Some of that has been proven to be human nature, but we're conditioned into that thinking through church, sports, entertainment, generational gaslighting, and brainwashing, everything. The cultism that I'm deconstructing is the everything I'm overthinking. The loyalties we hold to ideas that contradict what we say are our foundational values or principles. Moral dilemmas, moral compromises. This is philosophy, yes. It's deep and confusing. It may sound like I'm rambling about disconnected ideas, but this nation's unity is not much different than a marriage or sports fandom. Our ideals of loyalty, which is what I'm talking about with cultism, are so directly tied to the idea of marital vows and marital expectations and our ideals toward patriotism and nationalism. What I'm about to discuss in this episode is hope or a warning. Hope through the lens of the mistakes of our history. Hope for humanity, and maybe a story of hope for the future of our nation. I'm willing to bet you've never heard this story, and even if you have, you've probably never heard it this way. This may be an inspiration from which we might draw for the hope we need to heal this nation before the divorce. This story might just be a reminder that division isn't the answer, that secession, even for what seems to be the right reasons, isn't always the best plan, that leadership has its agenda, and usually the people pay the price. Maybe the divorce is imminent, unavoidable. I hope not. But if it is, maybe we can at least lower the social temperature a bit to, well, if not save this country, then at least mitigate the disaster when the fascists either take control or take their toys and go home to the country they create for themselves, wherever that might be. In America's short-lived history, amidst the last great division of our nation, there stood a community, an area, a region, who never forgot their roots, the reason that they came here to begin with. There was a state in this country, long forgotten by our history books, no longer drawn on maps, though throughout this region, echoes of that past remain. Landmarks, street names, memorials to America's long-lost state. This is a story of different perspectives on the same events. Events that would shape the nation as we know it today. Events that, had they gone the other way, would have drastically shifted America, if not risked the experiment of democracy. In my backyard, the area I call home, the place I chose to pursue a higher education, in East Tennessee, of all places, there was a lighthouse of hope in America's darkest hour, shrouded in the fog of corruption and conquest. Below the Mason-Dixon line, throughout the treasonous South, existed a pocket of unity and loyalty, a state you've never heard of, a state that ceased to exist before the war between the states even started. Before the state that never was even existed, but a state of mind that still existed beyond its banned borders. A state who stood up to the inhumane, antichrist, terrorist, white supremacist monsters of the Confederacy to form a safe haven of American values, ethics, morals, and integrity. A state that wouldn't stand for slavery, secession, and treason. In this episode, I may sound severe, but I'm being blunt, speaking frankly about a story most history teachers won't spend much time on. This episode is about America's sovereign state of Franklin. And welcome to the podcast. The Civil War was about a lot of things, but the individual states' rights were at the heart of it. Many make it about things other than slavery, but that's convenient retelling for their narrative. Just like with their Bibles and their constitutions, they like to cherry-pick from the facts they want to include in their version of history, the version they insist their family learn. We all do that, though, don't we? Retelling our tales to make us the hero, or at least less villainous or less pathetic. While the idea of an individual state having the freedom within the greater union to identify itself uniquely, legislatively, culturally, socially, economically, jurisdictionally, it's important to discuss and differentiate. The fact is, slavery was the reason for the split. It isn't as simple as that, but federal power versus individual liberties has always been our nation's friction, with the states serving as the lubricant. We don't get to cherry-pick facts and then pick out the nuance like it's grapes in a chicken salad. Ugh. We do get to look back at slavers as evil and inhumane monsters, each and every one. That was a choice people made, and the fact that dehumanization was normalized shouldn't be a justification or an excuse. We shouldn't condone or accept it as anything but monstrous just because it was a different time. The monsters were the reason it was a different time. The monsters kept it different for too long. We all know right and wrong when it comes to humanity. We know when we cross lines. Those lines aren't modern or ancient. Those lines don't change from normalization. They just are. They aren't defined by decades or progress or religions or rules. Cancel culture has always existed. Expelling the rotten from the harvest is the only way to keep the rest from rotting. This country's original sin was soul-selling inhumanity. You call that however you want. Racism through slavery, genocide through colonialism, classism through capitalism, misogyny, xenophobia, these are all decisions that people made and still make to this day. This episode is about decisions, hard decisions, standing up for what's right, even if it means you stand to lose everything, even your sovereignty, even your life. Standing up for what one might think is right, asking others to stand up for that principle, altruistic or not. In many situations, defining a clear right and wrong is difficult. This episode is about just that. Slavery is a given, and I've discussed that quite a bit this season. I think we can all accept that white supremacy, white superiority, and white nationalism play roles in the toxic white Southern culture I'm deconstructing this season. That isn't to dismiss those very serious crimes against humanity. It's to say that even if I'm not discussing those ideas, they are the layer of perspective that shrouds everything else I discuss here. So even if I'm not saying slavery, white supremacy, white superiority, and white nationalism specifically, where the topic of the founding of this nation and America's original sin is concerned, they're implied. The proud Southern conservatives wanted their economy to boom. Money is power and cash is king. Forget that America just broke free from the king less than a century prior. Bygones. The Southern states had fewer major ports, population centers, and less industrial influence. What the South had was agriculture galore. The South had seasonal climates to produce and grow what the country needed, on the scale the country needed. The Asian the well-forcibly labored rail system was connecting us more and more and moving all that grain, corn, cotton, and tobacco wherever it needed to go, wherever it would command the highest dollar. Cha-ching. Well, what the South had was land to settle, but limited labor. After all, who wants to work, am I right? I mean, who wants to trudge out in a field for hours a day under the sweltering and abusive radiation of the sun, wearing your body out night and day, planting and picking and whatever it is that happens on farms? Hell, I wouldn't know. It all sounded so loathsome to me, much less fun than eating it. So, with all that land to plant and so few people willing to plant, America planted people. Well, rather, America picked people and replanted them. Picked people from Africa, the Caribbean, Central and South America, Canada, Asia, indigenous tribes. Well, hell, if there was somewhere to pick people, America would pick them and plant them in a field somewhere for the right price. Cha-ching. In the time before you could buy a John Deere tractor, you'd buy a tractor of a man named John. Oh dear. With a minimal investment, you, the plantation entrepreneur, could have implemented a labor force. How many workers do you need? You just buy them. It's like RAM for your computer. You need faster processing? Plug a new stick of RAM into your computer. You need to increase profits? Just plug a few dozen uncompensated workers into the field and see what happens. That low overhead. The abolitionists in the North and those who chose not to participate in the practice of slavery in the South were playing a losing game of prosperity. The greedy, inhumane monsters in the South were profiting off murder, torture, and abuse. They had a completely different economy than other states. Well, let's just not discuss states for a bit. Let's look at it as businesses, right? Farms, companies, rather than states, since states' rights is such a trigger phrase. What I'm about to discuss is your counter to the idea that the North wanted to abolish slavery to cripple the South's economy because the South was gaining too much power in Washington, or that the South had inadequate representation in our government due to the sparse population of this vast farmland. These are the common arguments I've heard for a very long time to dismiss the fact that the South seceded from the United States, committed treason, and murdered hundreds of thousands of Americans over slavery. I mean, some Confederates died trying to murder Americans too, but who the living fuck cares about Confederate deaths? They were the anti-American, anti-Christian murderers. They were the terrorists. They were white supremacists. That's easy to say. Well, families fought together, and not every person who fought for the Confederacy was a treasonous white supremacist. But that's just fool's rationale, my friends. Convenient reshaping of facts to suit one's agenda. We don't say that about World War II Germany, do we? North Korea, Iraq, Russia, China, that revolving door of Middle Eastern extremist terrorists we hear so much about, African genocidal kidnappers, the Mafia, the Vatican, State of Israel. Grow up. That's what I tell silly billies when they act silly and say silly things like the Civil War wasn't about slavery or that those serving in the Confederacy didn't deserve to die. In fact, we should have hung every surviving loyalist, man and woman, throw the kids in schools. Boy, ain't that a controversial and unsavory opinion? How can that guy write books on compassion? The critical thinking part of my Compassion and Critical Thinking workbook. What we see today is that the Confederacy never died because we never killed it. The good people weren't willing to do what needed to be done because then the good people aren't good people anymore. The goalposts move. We never exterminated the ideology. I'm not sure how you do that humanely without getting rid of the people with that ideology. Germany failed, fascism is thriving today, and more specifically, the actual Nazis are becoming more prominent. They mask themselves as Moms for Liberty, the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, the 3%, the 1%, Patriot Front, Patriot Church, Daughters of the Confederacy, the Federalist Society, Rise Above Movement, Awake 21, Vanguard America, Active Clubs, the Base, Traditional Youth Movement. Yeah, Traditional Youth Movement. That one grooms and targets kids. League of the South, Identity Europa, the American Identity Movement, American Renaissance, the National Socialist Order, but these aren't economic socialists. Let's pause. We're getting ahead of ourselves because this part's important. I think you get what I'm saying about all these groups in America that are allowed to exist today, whose ideals are directly paralleled with fascist ideology, according to the character. And both had factions migrate to South America to escape responsibility for those inhumane actions. Now, I need to be perfectly clear here. This isn't politics. This is humanity. This is a question of who is capable of turning on their fellow man and murdering them for the sake of a corrupt government or narcissistic sociopathic madman. Now, the follow-up question is, now what do we do with those people? So we coexist for another 100 years, saying we like the brown folk, but spitting on them when they come out of their separate bathrooms until we're told we can't sick police dogs on them anymore or hose them down. Then we have to figure out how to live with those people that some Americans considered livestock for so long, until they were told they were bad for thinking that. So rather than stopping looking at them as livestock, they just started seeing them as glorified livestock, like show cattle you take to the county fair. So then they're on TV as punchlines and laughable characters, and dynamite, that's not acceptable anymore, so we have to start taking them seriously as human beings. Oh, the pain. The goalposts certainly moved, whether we wanted to admit it or not. America's practice of blackface is shameful. But I'm not talking about Hollywood makeup, folks. I'm talking about America's continued insistence that this nation is free and open, that we are the hub of diversity and democracy. However, when you look at our history, it seems America is all talk with very little action. We're like the abusive partner in that near-divorce marriage, the one who hits us. Then when we have our stuff packed, they beg us to stay, promising they'll get therapy. Then once we unpack, we're told we're the reason they're so abusive and they don't need therapy. We need marriage counseling instead. Yeah, America is kind of a narcissist. The problem is, we've taken the abuse for so long, the American working class, and then respectfully accepted the scraps of humanity we've been tossed with no accountability for the inhumanity of our past, that now, when so many people are speaking out, the narcissist is playing the victim. Now, instead of us packing up, having had enough of the abuse, ready to end this thing, they are the ones threatening to leave. Again. Just like they always have. Anti-federalists, Confederates, early 20th century corporate fascists, Goldwater Republicans, Dixiecrats, Reagan Republicans, all the way to MAGA. We've seen the echoes of this social personality disorder for a long time. Every time things start to not go their way, they pack their toys, ready to go home. Or in the case of this segment of America, they load up their guns, ready for war. Or another mass shooting. The fact is, America has been at war with himself since his earliest beginnings. I'm trying to get out of the habit of feminizing America since he is clearly jacked up on testosterone. Early founders formed this land under trauma. Trauma they experienced back in England, Ireland, and Scotland, Northern Europe. They had all this fear, bitterness, suspicion, and paranoia. And who wouldn't, given the historical facts surrounding why they wanted to leave where they were from, to come to a place where they could start from scratch? I'll cover a lot more of that by the end of this series. Just know, these weren't a mentally healthy people seeking a peaceful refuge. These were people who knew there would be a cost to their new way of life and had justified those atrocities against humanity through their faith. Then, they brought their trauma here, brutalized and massacred the indigenous peoples of this land, and did it all in the name of a God they couldn't begin to comprehend. Traumatized people traumatizing other traumatized people, but on a much grander scale. This original sin wasn't even specifically slavery. It was the soul-selling inhumanity of dehumanization, slaughter, and genocide. I know, this is from a perspective maybe you aren't used to. Maybe you're thinking, well, the natives were savages, but that's selective narrative by the oppressors. In most cases, the indigenous natives of this continent had rich cultures that were largely wiped out with no regard. Quick to label them uncivilized, because animals are fair game, unintended. Killing an animal makes you a hunter. Killing a human makes you a murderer. The reality of our history is harder to swallow. Before the first plantation was plowed, this land's indigenous peoples had to be cleared off that land. The sin of dehumanization and inhumanity, from there, just fell like dominoes. This history lesson is one you probably haven't heard of, don't remember, or weren't even taught. In the late 1700s, as the newly formed nation of the United States of America was established, there were some growing pains, to put it mildly. These growing pains were the result, at least partly, from so much new land to govern with little structural stability within that government. In the case of Tennessee, before Tennessee was Tennessee, a growing frustration was brewing in the western Appalachian region of North Carolina, now what we know as most of East Tennessee. Specifically, from the southeastern border north, the easterly pointing tip of modern-day Tennessee, the counties of Blount, Sevier, Caswell, which is now Hamlin and Jefferson, Greene, which now includes Cocke County, Spencer, which is now Hawkins, Sullivan, Wayne, now Johnson and Carter counties, and Washington, which now includes Unicoi County. While the names Caswell, Spencer, and Wayne are no longer used, it's historically important to note that these counties did once exist. While North Carolina was establishing itself post-Revolutionary War, many explorers and frontiersmen venturing to the West were feeling left out. They didn't like the North Carolina government and how they were serving them, as well as the areas more central to the state's government. In fact, in those days, that wasn't a rare sentiment. As this nation rapidly expanded, those out on the fringes of society struggled to find the support for their new ventures from the state struggling to recover from a war, a new government, and all the things that come with the infancy of a new nation. In many of those cases, as the years progressed, those territories might apply for their own statehood. In the case of Western North Carolina, that's exactly what happened. This area was a vast, mountainous land, sparsely populated, but with lots of potential. The North Carolinian government, far away from the wildlands of the West, was slow to act and respond to concerns from those who settled further out. When we talk about the issue of states' rights, this is actually a fitting example, more than the rest of the South, in fact. In this case, these areas were more like inconvenient outliers for North Carolina, who had problems close to home to contend with, including financial debt to the federal government for costs involved with the war against England for American independence. To appease some of that financial burden, North Carolina had ceded much of the territory to the West to the federal government as compensation, and in doing so, created sort of a vacuum of bureaucracy. Those who had chosen to settle these lands were then left with what exactly? If they weren't North Carolinians any longer, exactly who was taking care of business? The pioneers of this territory were successful early on because of this spirit of self-reliance, something Tennessee isn't really known for today. Not only were these settlers gifted in resilience, but also in agriculture, manufacturing, and other means of producing what they needed themselves, rather than having to rely on someone else to bail them out. Modern Tennessee is one of those red states that feeds off the flourishing blue states in America. Seeing early on that these lands and its peoples were on their own, those peoples embraced that and ran with it to much early success. Behind notable leaders whose names are now synonymous with the region, this wannabe state began to organize and had determined that they could and should run this land by their own accord, rather than being subject to the whims and timelines of North Carolina's state government or the federal government, neither of which showed too much interest in their interests. These were a people who simply wanted to build and flourish and exist. But the bureaucracy of early American post-Revolutionary War governments was creating more hindrances than help. In 1785, in the now picturesque town of Jonesboro, Tennessee, those early leaders gathered a convention to declare their independence from North Carolina as the sovereign state of Franklin, named after Benjamin. Remember, though, that North Carolina had basically handed this region over to the federal government. So these were essentially a people without a state to call home, or the resources that state might offer. They were a territory of unsure allegiances. It wasn't just about freedom, though. Liberty. The insisted emancipation these people, led by a man named John Sevier, was largely the result of a growing economy. See, one thing about East Tennessee is the land is prime for agriculture, and those early settlers were largely farmers and those who sought to own lots of land. Crops like corn, tobacco, cotton, and wheat were grown with ease and in abundance, thanks to what draws many to settle in the area today: the weather. Seasonal climate changes, offering comparably mild winters, robust summers, and a spring and fall, which too are quite mild and somewhat predictable, allowed for these grounds to be, pardon the pun, ripe for the picking. Now, you might think that's for plantations, and you might be right. However, in this region, slavery was not the primary source of labor. Many of these people were not only self-sufficient, but also not altogether wealthy aristocrats. It's not to say they didn't have slaves or participate in the slave trade, as we'll cover later on. These weren't a flawless people. What really made the state of Franklin appealing as a place to settle down was the cost of living. Even back in those days, the early leaders of the region had established a very well-regulated system of land ownership that made purchasing property quite affordable and attractive to those looking for a new beginning. Property rights were favorable to these new landowners. Settlers opened a network of trade with surrounding states, territories, and even tried to make inroads with the local indigenous communities. If it sounds to you like the state of Franklin seemed to want to do things a little bit differently than they'd seen much of the colonies do before the establishment of the United States, well, you'd be wrong. I'll clear that up in a bit. With this newfound prosperity, settlement and growth increased, boosting the economy. Affordable land prices, rich soil brought about good investments for those who dared to brave this new frontier. John Sevier's leadership initially brought stability to the region, which helped solidify the chances the state of Franklin would receive ratified statehood by the Union. By 1785, the state of Franklin would have its own drafted state constitution, a path to self-governance. Behind Governor John Sevier and a bicameral legislature, representatives and senators, the state of Franklin was growing beyond just an experiment, but in its own independent government. However, with financial success and popularity, and now the will of the people to be independent, the federal government and North Carolina would seek to get their piece of that pie and regain control of the region. The story of the state of Franklin is historically short. Within just 3 years of that state constitution being drafted, the experiment would be over, cut off at the knees before it could even start. Also known as the Free Republic of Franklin, these settlers weren't satisfied with North Carolina's governance of the area, or their willingness to just give the land back to the feds. So a petition for independent statehood was on the table. North Carolina wasn't eager to offer settlers in this region a voice of representation in their own government for various reasons, which left the Franklinites feeling neglected. North Carolina, struggling under the weight of debt from the Revolutionary War, prioritized infrastructure closer to home, leaving those settled in the wilderness to fend more for themselves, which the state of Franklin did. The threat of attack from the indigenous peoples, none too thrilled about colonizer invaders stealing their homes and lands, was real, and North Carolina didn't seem too concerned with those threats, at least not concerned enough to offer any military support to the outliers. In fact, given North Carolina's attitude toward the region, it seems like these pioneers had no choice but to organize to fend for themselves, better, to survive. However, with so many chiefs in the governing kitchen, squabbles over land ownership, property disputes, legal challenges, and conflicts over who owned what arose. Between North Carolina and the federal government, both issuing land grants, it created confusion and a contentious atmosphere. Sovereign statehood seemed like the only logical answer. Those people sought autonomy and control of their economy. They sought the American dream of pioneering and prosperity. Granted through the lens of colonial conquest and murder, like all of America, but given the context of the time, the state of Franklin could have been a shining beacon of hope for others and might have shifted the course of America's philosophy of statehood. Given context of the story, which you'll learn in just a bit, it's a story of treason, secession, and sociopathic slaughter. All good things must come to an end, right? Especially when they're too good to be true. The Free Republic of Franklin's economy was strong for a while, it seemed. However, an independent economy stands alone on an island, vulnerable to attack on every side without the stability of a much larger economy overseeing it. In this case, the federal government wasn't too keen on granting independent statehood to the state of Franklin. And North Carolina, seeing what this region was capable of, was hesitant to just let them go without a fight. That economy was strong when they were a part of North Carolina, and even when they ceded to the federal government. However, once they petitioned for statehood and began organizing in such a way as to create that self-reliant government, they quickly went belly up. There simply wasn't the tax revenue in this sparsely populated land to sustain a state economy. Even if individual agriculture and manufacturing economies might have thrived, the state-level institutions suffered, struggling to generate revenue, and weakened what seemed to be a potential stable economic foundation for this new state. Not to mention defense, both military and legal. The thing about colonialism is it's never happy with what it has. It's greed and conquest. In order to facilitate greed and conquest, one must have people to fight for it. And that costs a lot. So financial woes begat our not quite yet estate. That stress and animosity bled out through the peoples, causing division, causing disputes. Similar to modern divisiveness, the state of Franklin was divided between those who wanted sovereign statehood and those who opposed the move. Just like today, those disputes, divisions, and disagreements devolved what promised to be a case study in early American independence into a dysfunctional and abject failure. That dysfunction and the resulting economic challenges were too much to overcome. The experiment was quickly unraveling, and the true motivations behind the movement were shining through. By 1788, the federal government refused to acknowledge the Free Republic of Franklin as the state of Franklin, or otherwise. Diplomatic relations suffered as a result. Those trade agreements with surrounding states and territories began to crumble under the pressure of federal and state coercion, and relationships with local indigenous communities grew more hostile, with more and more settlers flocking to this region, taking more and more land and resources away from those indigenous communities. With the Franklinites played for pawns, with their king in check and North Carolina about to checkmate. I hope that's right, I don't play chess, but the lasting legacy of the failed state of Franklin, one could argue, is a mirroring of what we see today. Much of the current state of Tennessee has been consumed by conservative carpetbaggers moving to this area in an effort to create the fascist utopia they can't find anywhere else in America. When one examines the origins of this region and the circumstances under which the state of Franklin blossomed and withered, one might see the fruit from the poisonous tree. Not so much the legal definition as the metaphorical allusions. Despite the tempting fruit that grows from the seemingly stable tree, if the tree itself is poisonous, or in this case poisoned, the fruit is going to at very least be a little hard to swallow. Just like the truth about East Tennessee and the state of Franklin. The unborn state of Franklin was aborted in its final trimester. While the Free Republic of Franklin was a failed experiment for several reasons, and ended before the turn of the century, the ideals of that movement lasted for generations, and the echoes of those values can still be seen by some in the region to this day. By the early 1800s, the moral stain and strain of slavery was weighing on more and more and more people, North and South. In the case of America's race relations, be it non-consensual African immigrants, or this land's indigenous peoples, or any other group Caucasian colonialism has oppressed, the tradition of dehumanization met the progress of humanity and compassion head on. What resulted was the seismic shock of that friction, which would cause a Mason-Dixon-sized fault line in the mid-19th century. While the U.S.'s racial relations isn't as easy as one event in history, looking back at this particular event in context might offer some valuable perspective and insight as we move forward toward what seems to be an inevitable division today. The state of Franklin, or the Free Republic of Franklin, sought sovereignty from North Carolina, and to be declared its own separate state with all the rights and freedoms associated with sovereign statehood. Self-reliance, liberty, and freedom. Democratic values, local representation, ideals many can get behind. Rugged individualism, resilience, determination, and self-governance are the foundation that built the state of Franklin. Responsible governance, economic freedom, prosperity. When one thinks about this brief blip in American history, those are what comes to mind. These ideas harken back to federalism and anti-federalism. Now, it's safe to say that by the late 1700s, many who flocked to what is now East Tennessee might have been on either side of the previous constitutional debate, while some might have challenged their positions as a result of being in the unsettled Appalachian wilderness with no real support from their state government. Still, the distrust for government was likely present in many, thus contributing to their feelings on independent statehood versus just staying West North Carolina or whatever the federal government had planned for them. Then we look to Tennessee's moniker, the volunteer state, which came about later due to the people's ideals of civic involvement and community responsibility. I want to be clear about something. History is ugly, and colonialism comes with a cost. That cost is blood. The early American colonists' atrocities against humanity and what amounts to war crimes are often whitewashed by American history books. They weren't the heroes of the frontier. They were animals, brutal, savage, uncivilized animals. The Franklinites, too, were not an innocent people to be praised without context. They, too, were brutal murderers and exploitive pioneers, the American way. They raided and stole lands from the indigenous, whom they undoubtedly saw as less than human, less than worthy of living there, or less than worthy of living in some cases at all. While some might choose a perspective of self-defense in some of these actions, is it really self-defense when you invade someone's home and they try to defend that home and you kill them? No. That's cold-blooded murder. Sociopathic. The good person turns around and says, "This clearly doesn't belong to me. Maybe I should make friends with these folks if I want to be welcomed into their home." The sociopath just kills everyone in their way and then justifies it. Now let's pause for a moment of context. To understand this fully, we have to not only examine what was going on with the settlers, but the indigenous peoples native to these lands. Back in the decades before the 1800s, the Cherokee occupied most of the territory that would become East Tennessee. The country back then was divided, and the Native Americans of this area were no exception. Just as the Franklinites were split between those loyal to the North Carolina state government and the United States federal government, there were those who wanted independent statehood. In 1775, the year before most recognized the birth of our version of this nation, the Cherokee Nation was torn between accommodationist Cherokees, who felt the best path for surviving the brutal Caucasian conquest of their lands was to be accepted by the colonists, later Americans. The Cherokee gave the white man benefit of doubt that they would be taken care of if they just played nice. They seemed to realize the coming storm of colonial expansion as white people were breeding like bunnies and spreading like a virus. So these Cherokee decided to assimilate as best they could and accommodate as much as possible, hoping that strategy would build enough goodwill that the Americans would see them as more equals and give them their land that they already owned. Or at very least allow them to stay on their land, even if the Americans did take most of it. No spoilers, we know how that story ended. The other faction of the split in the Cherokee Nation were the Chickamaugas, who took the polar opposite approach. Their philosophy to Caucasian colonialism was resistance. We all know how that ended. What's fascinating about this subplot of the history of the state of Franklin is that this split happened just as the colonies were rebelling against England, less than a decade or so before the Franklinites seceded. This tension over the territory that would become East Tennessee had been brewing for some time by the time things came to a head in the late 1700s between North Carolina, the federal government, and the Franklinites. When the Cherokee Nation divided, the Chickamaugas became sort of a social experiment of American melting pot diversity and equality. What bred from that was the Cherokee who had split from the larger Cherokee Nation to become the Chickamauga, but also in this Chickamauga Confederacy, other tribes and even colonists who felt cast out or disenfranchised with the running of this new country had thrown in with the Chickamauga. Led by Chief Dragging Canoe, this new tribe, a coalition of sorts, began as an alliance of those who oppressed the ideals and principles that were the foundation of America's rebellion from England: slavery and the unlawful, inhumane expansion of the colonies. England had made themselves pretty clear on a few things for the colonies. They would be phasing out the practice of slavery within a few decades. and they didn't want that stain on their new lands. And this land was our land. This land wasn't your land, and you weren't to take more than you were granted by the crown. Americans being what Americans are, again, we know how that story ended. The colonists were a brutal and savage people, inhumane, slaughtering those who opposed them and offering trinkets as a consolation prize for the lands stolen from the peoples native to the lands the colonists invaded. If they offered anything at all besides musket fire. The colonies wanted to keep their slaves, put them to work growing this new economy. They wanted this country for themselves, natives be damned. The Chickamauga became an alliance of various indigenous tribes, communities, and peoples who opposed the idea of accommodating such uncivilized people who only wished to destroy their sacred lands. Then, we saw some of the English Tories, colonists loyal to the crown, the suspicious and often oppressed Scots-Irish, and the Africans and those descended who had escaped slavery. This Chickamauga Confederacy began as the American Revolution was unfolding and lasted until just before the turn of the century, which we'll cover in a bit. While efforts were made to form relations with those friendlier indigenous communities, it's important to note that Western expansion posed many issues for the stability of this region striving for statehood. Battles are expensive. Pioneering, building, settling, all that costs money. While the region's economic boom was initially optimistic, expansion and growth also come with a price. Usually money and blood. Just like the Cherokee at the time, the Franklinites were divided on several contentious fronts. Within these peoples, you had many whose desire for a new, independent existence did not include the slaughter of others. You had many whose desire for a simple life on the frontier didn't include swearing fealty to a new state government or even a federal government. Still some anti-federalists in the mix. With the go-ahead from the United States, North Carolina would make attempts to bring this region and its peoples back. In 1786, offering to waive back taxes if they dropped their bid for sovereign statehood. The Free Republic of Franklin said no thanks to that in the following year, and North Carolina had little choice but to invade. After all, these were secessionists seeking to basically steal the land they were granted by the United States and North Carolina. It's all about perspective. That's right. The Franklinites were also secessionists, technically. Their reasons for seceding from North Carolina notwithstanding, they still sought to secede, which to some might come off as disloyal or even treasonous. The infighting and division among themselves, along with the Cherokee-American Wars, contributed to the end of this people's desire for sovereign statehood. However, North Carolina was the final nail in Franklin's coffin. What's sort of historically amusing about this is that the Franklinites' desire for statehood came initially because they felt largely ignored and unassisted by North Carolina's government. Don't it always seem to go that you don't know what you've got till it's gone? Well, North Carolina paved this paradise and packed up a fighting lot to seize control and settle the chaos caused by the makeshift, not quite state government. So what happened is the offer to waive the tax debt was refused. That meant the tax debt stood and North Carolina was coming to collect. The order was to seize any and all properties of John Sevier to go toward repayment. So the lands and property, which included some slaves, were seized by the forces led by Colonel John Tipton, who was sent to the region to establish a North Carolinian state government in what is now Jonesboro, Tennessee. For a while, both Franklin's government and North Carolina's government operated parallel, which must have been confusing for those early settlers. Tipton's home, which is now the Tipton-Haynes Historic Site, was where the Battle of Franklin would take place in February 1788. The battle, if you will, lasted all of 10 minutes, with Sevier's forces met with an equal battalion of reinforcements of Tipton's. 3 men died, many were captured and wounded, and John Sevier, the governor of the region, retreated. Here's where it gets really interesting, though. Over the course of the next several weeks, more and more attacks from the indigenous communities would come. If the North Carolinian advancements, along with varied divisions within the Franklinites, weren't enough to end the experiment, the settlers on both sides experienced attacks coming from the Cherokee, Chickasaw, and other surrounding communities who were just defending their lands. John Sevier, with help from James White, the founder of Knoxville, Tennessee, would double down on their treasonous secession, nearly dismantling any altruism behind their initial push for sovereignty by seeking to align with a foreign power. Sevier sought out loans from Spain to fund their fight against North Carolina, the indigenous communities, and the United States federal government. That's right. Future Governor John Sevier, for whom Sevier County, Tennessee is named, conspired with James White, who has his own parkway in Knoxville. James White, who was later revealed to be a paid agent of Spain to place control of what is now East Tennessee under Spanish rule. Now, I've made the comment, "I claim this land for Spain," as a joke, an homage to Magellan for most of my life. But in this case, John Sevier and James White tried to do just that. North Carolina nor the federal government wanted a foreign power controlling territories in the United States. So, Sevier was arrested in the fall of 1788. While his agents liberated him from imprisonment, Sevier would turn himself in a few months later and swear fealty to North Carolina the following year. North Carolina would send in their armies to clean up the mess the Franklinites created. By early 1789, with the state of Franklin no more, back under the reign of North Carolina, who had initially ceded the lands to the federal government, causing those settlers in that region to secede from the state, once again ceded that region right back to the United States federal government, who declared it the Southwest Territory. John Sevier, for all his problematic choices and blood on his hands, would get elected to represent the new Southwest Territory in Congress the following year. It still wasn't over. From Franklin bred Lesser Franklin, which was basically most of what is now Sevier County, where modern tourist traps like the Great Smoky Mountains, Gatlinburg, Dollywood, Pigeon Forge, and Sevierville are all located. Both North Carolina and the United States considered those settlers squatters on Cherokee lands. Those squatters felt entitled to the lands they had stolen and declared themselves for independent statehood, a movement which ended in 1791 when Governor William Blount's negotiations of the Treaty of Holston resulted in the Overhill Cherokee ceding their lands to the power of the United States government. Chickamauga chief Dragging Canoe would die the following year of natural causes, it seems, and control of that tribe would revert to tribes more north. Canoe's initial rebuttal, decades prior to those accommodationist Cherokee, was that if the land was allowed to be taken by the colonist Americans, the Cherokee would become extinct. He wasn't wrong. Within 7 years of the land of the state of Franklin, the Southwest Territory would be redesignated as Tennessee and would be admitted into the Union as our nation's 16th state, with John Sevier as its inaugural governor. Yeah. Not only did this guy, who basically led a treasonous secession movement, masked as a quest for self-reliance and sovereign statehood, then turned traitor to negotiate with foreign countries to bail him out financially, he got elected to Congress and governor. Sound familiar? Throughout the decades between the fall of the state of Franklin and the secession of the Confederacy, the new state of Tennessee would feel the lasting effects of that experiment. Just as those early settlers were dissatisfied with the distant North Carolinian state government's lack of attention to the region, East Tennessee often felt disregarded and disrespected by the other factions of the state, despite the new state capital being in Knoxville. That capital would drift farther west during those decades, first to Kingston, a 45-minute drive from West Knoxville, then out to Middle Tennessee, hours away, eventually resting in Nashville. On the state flag of Tennessee, there are 3 stars which represent West, Middle, and East Tennessee. three distinct regions with distinct cultures of their own: Memphis, Nashville, and Knoxville, respectively. East Tennessee's settlers felt the financial investments in infrastructure were more focused on West and Middle Tennessee's establishment than in the area already established by the Franklinites over a decade prior. While this reputation of the volunteer state gives outsiders a feeling like everyone in this region was gung-ho to stand up and fight at whomever's beck and call, it isn't quite that simple. Tennessee was divided ideologically for most of the early 1800s. In fact, Lincoln's vice president and the man who is credited as one of our worst presidents in history, Andrew Johnson, revitalized the movement to declare East Tennessee its separate state in the 1840s. That move failed, but the idea wouldn't die. It would be floated around consistently until the dawn of the Civil War. If you're thinking this area and its peoples, for all their questionable allegiances, loyalties, and self-serving natures, would have strapped on the gray uniform to slaughter their fellow American, hold your horses. This story takes a turn. Amidst the clash of the country in the mid-1800s, the lines of loyalty were laid out, but gerrymandered, if you will. It isn't that the North were abolitionists and the South were slavers. Nothing is that black and white. Cut and dry. By the end of the state of Franklin experiment, laws were beginning to be passed by northern states that would have started the process of abolishing slavery. Vermont, the first state in the Union to abolish slavery, wasn't even a state yet technically, followed by Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and Connecticut. Early America was seemingly coming to their senses. The South's reluctance to ban the practice was due to their reliance on the practice. The South's economy was strong because of the low overhead. They didn't have to pay their workers. Pass those savings on to you, the consumer. By the first decade of the 19th century, the United States was divided among free states and slave states. That would be the struggle between our nation for much of the first half of that century. Let's fast forward, because we know how this story ends. When the Civil War began, America's 34 states were divided into three segments, more or less. 15 of those were slave states, while the remaining 19 were free states, those who had abolished slavery. Now, the third faction, 4 slave states, were called the border states: Kentucky, Missouri, Delaware, and Maryland. These states might have been slave states, but they opted not to turn traitor and secede from the Union. A smart move, seeing as how strategically they would be the first to suffer great casualties or fall in battle. With the surrounding states of Kentucky, Virginia, and North Carolina slave states, and Tennessee sharing similar ideological origins, it made sense that Tennessee would fall to the Confederacy. In fact, Tennessee was one of the initial 11 states to secede. By the time of the Emancipation Proclamation going into effect, the state was back under the control of the United States. They still turned traitor over the right to own slaves. However, there, in the mountains of East Tennessee, many of the early Appalachian settlers chose a different path, just like many had when they joined forces with the Chickamauga Confederacy, which wasn't at all like the South's Confederacy. What was the lost state, the Free Republic of Franklin, or the state of Franklin, would foster some hope among that carnage. The state of Franklin's origins, the values of the people, not necessarily those who seceded and sought sovereign statehood, resonated. Remember those values I spoke about, the foundations of the region: self-reliance, liberty, and freedom, democratic values, local representation, rugged individualism, resilience, determination, and self-governance, responsible governance. Those values didn't completely align with the Confederacy's desire to enslave humans. Those democratic values of the people and that local representation was annihilated by the decision to secede from the United States. who spoke for those unwilling to fight for an immoral, monstrous cause. The liberty and freedom, in this case of the slaves, were being hindered, all tying back to the idea of responsible governance. These were a people who felt irresponsibly governed by North Carolina, the United States federal government, and then its own state of Tennessee later on. In the case of secession, the values of self-governance would reemerge. To a people who had seen slavery as abhorrent and inhumane, a violation of their values and Christianity in many cases, Tennessee's betrayal of America over that issue was unacceptable. The rugged individualism, self-reliance, and determination were what kept most of the non-slavers in what was the state of Franklin alive, and in some cases prospering. Granted, the state of Franklin failed because those who established it and sought statehood were corrupt of mind, spirit, and ethics. It's hard to argue otherwise. As I said, a slaver is a slaver, and that's just not something we can overlook, even in context of the time. By the time the state of Franklin was established, states in this nation were coming around to abolishing the practice of slavery for various reasons. People knew. People chose to own slaves. East Tennessee was as divided as the rest of the nation, but their division hit closer to home. While the northern states had those sympathetic to the South, white supremacists, racists, the denormalization of that dehumanization was beginning. Whereas in the South, it was just as difficult to be an abolitionist among those sociopathic slavers. Many in the region weren't wealthy, not wealthy enough to own slaves, even if they'd wanted to. Slave ownership was more an affluent practice. Slaves were property, like livestock, and one couldn't always afford to buy a new mule to pull the tractor or the plow any more than one could afford to go out to the slave auctions and bid on a human. That doesn't mean the poor people of East Tennessee were abolitionists. It means some were. Some were just too damn poor to be able to afford a walking whipping post. Still, throughout the region of East Tennessee, those values of the Free Republic of Franklin's peoples and the principles of the Chickamauga Confederacy lived on, decades after the failed experiment. The northeastern tip of Tennessee would become a beacon of hope that all was not lost to sociopathic slavers in the South. That region, what once was the state of Franklin, stood against the Confederacy, aligning with the Union, staying loyal to the United States of America, despite that federal government refusing to recognize it 3/4 of a century prior. Regardless, that secessionist mentality, the one that made the region break from North Carolina, contesting the federal government, later fighting against both, would serve them well when their own state seceded from the Union. The state of Franklin, or what once was, seceded from the secession to remain allied and loyal to the United States of America. These Southern Unionists were white Southerners who remained loyal to the United States during the Civil War. Confederates referred to these groups as Tories, which was a slur used in the Revolutionary War to describe those colonists loyal to England. After the Civil War, Lincoln's loyalists were called scalawags, if you've ever wondered where that term came from. I know you've probably heard it more in pirate speak, like carpetbagger, a term Southerners used for Northerners coming to the region, the South, to exploit the lands, resources, and peoples for their own gain. Projection much? Tennessee boasted the highest number of white soldiers fighting for the United States during the Civil War, a great deal of that due to the ideologies of East Tennesseans. Remember Andrew Johnson, Lincoln's vice president? He had his many problems, but he was an early and influential Union loyalist from Tennessee. His efforts to declare East Tennessee its own independent state stemmed from the recognition in the cultural, ethical, and moral differences in that region above the rest of the state and the South. Still, even without sovereign independent statehood, East Tennessee stood against the Confederacy, the sociopathic slavers, and were a large part of why Tennessee wouldn't have to be one of the 10 states referred to by the Emancipation Proclamation. While the state of Tennessee betrayed the nation in a similar way, the state of Franklin attempted to secede from North Carolina. The lessons learned of that period were apparently learned, adapted, and evolved in a manner resulting in a loyalty to the United States and a loyalty to some semblance of humanity most of the South seemed otherwise immune and incapable. Maybe we can learn something from this history lesson. I hope this isn't received improperly. I'm not advocating for a secession from our union in any way. I'm simply addressing the real fact that some in this country have stated for quite some time that the possibility is at very least on the table for them. In recent history, many conservatives have justified this sort of sentiment in many ways, though all of them with the underlying implications of violence. States across the nation are implementing legislation that for some is either upholding their rights or eliminating them altogether. This is what I call secession legislation. Rather than officially seceding from the United States and fending for themselves economically or being invaded by our military, these states enact the kinds of laws and enforceable rules that make it uncomfortable, difficult, or unsafe for certain people, certain groups of people to stay, forcing those people to flee to friendlier areas, just like many abolitionists and freed slaves fled the South so many years ago. A society crafted for a vocal minority who justify their atrocities through patriotic and religious means. The narrative becoming, if you stand against us, you stand against America and God, whether you believe in either or not. Those who oppose are then the social outliers, the riffraff, the undesirables. Before long, those who don't flee will be Jim Crowed to death, literally in a lot of cases. States like Tennessee, Alabama, Florida, Texas, and across the Southeast United States, and our more rural areas where education and free thought are less favored upon, are embracing archaic attitudes about North America's peoples. They always have expressed some rather unsavory ideas about everyone and everywhere else, but this is a dehumanization we've seen before. This is a devolutionary shift in ethics and morality that has just been justified and normalized by our media. Not the media in the way you're probably thinking, but our media, as in the stuff we choose to shove down our brain throats. Those choices shape our perspective and personalities, for better or for worse, in sickness, in health, till death do we depart. To assume that we are immune to that influence is arrogant. To assume that we can comprehend the damage done is to be on the groundbreaking cutting edge of psychosocioscience. To believe that you are you, and that has nothing to do with anything you've ever read, watched, or listened to, is beyond ridiculous. We have allowed this division, this split in our society, in our nation, and in our culture. We saw it coming miles away, but we thought it couldn't happen to us. Truth is, it doesn't matter if it's Russian disinformation attacks, manipulated misinformation within our own, propagated propaganda to promote the oppression of the proletariat perspective. None of that matters, because the choice between right and wrong has always been there, right in front of us. It's just often been the hardest thing to choose. The right thing usually isn't the most fun or satisfying thing. That's why the red words in that book we don't like talking about say things like turn the other cheek or judge not ... Those aren't easy tasks. That's why they take practice. And just like the Jedi, choosing the light side of peace or the dark side of retaliation determines the energy you possess, harness, and put out in the world. The choice was there when this country was first conceived, and before that when these lands were first colonized by Spanish slavers and subsequently by Northern European Caucasian slavers. And make no mistake, this country was founded by slavers from first landing to today. Very little has changed but the wages, and those haven't moved a whole lot since the 1860s. So, very little this country does is done without being laced in blood or the exploitation of others. Oh, but you could say that about every country, Josh. I very well could, But we aren't talking about Germany, Venezuela, North Korea, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Israel, Palestine, Argentina, South Africa, Russia, or anywhere else. We are talking about, in this show, about the United States of America. This is the culture of cultism I'm deconstructing. That cultism, from the start, has been one of dehumanization, desensitization from the atrocities committed by our fellow humans against other humans. And worse yet, the absolute refusal to properly confront, address, and make amends for those actions. We may be divided, friends, but this division is certainly something that could have been repaired under the proper leadership. America, once again, fell prey to corporate capitalist greed, electing candidates on every level who could do something for someone they owed a favor to rather than do good for we the people. No. I'm not advocating for secession or separation or division. I simply see it on the horizon. Much like those late 18th century Western North Carolinians knew when they fought for what would become East Tennessee. Seeing the inevitable. Let's at least go down swinging, right? What would break my heart, and the heart of any American, would be to see our nation's map split, segmented, bordered out to where traveling to another state might be considered international travel one day. If the United States of America became like Europe, several different separate countries, territories, regions, governments, rights, laws, and freedoms, customs, cultures, that would mean the United States of America was a failed experiment. Something we thought we could do and only hurt everyone in the process, just like the failed state of Franklin. Just like the doomed marriage example from before. When a couple meets and sees they have similarly aligned goals, but maybe there are a lot of red flags that they probably won't work, but they just say to hell with it and let's just be together. We can make this work. But then it's constant bitterness, resentment, unfulfilled needs, and unrealistic, unmet expectations, and passive-aggressive behavior. Both partners just snipping at one another until the kids are traumatized, miserable, and sent off to traumatize other traumatized people. It's doomed from the start. They just wouldn't listen. Now they've got kids and pets and responsibilities, and their lives, friends, and family are all intertwined. Rather than just realizing some people thought we should have a federal government and some people thought we should be a confederation of states and trying to make everyone happy, and that scenario just wasn't possible. Instead, we forged ahead with this union, risking destruction of everything we've all worked so hard for, just so we can say we're the United States of America? I don't know what to say to a secessionist, an insurrectionist, a conservative American who believes this country would be better off without some of us. That's because I believe this country would be better off without them. My indoctrinated ideas on other people, the ideas of dehumanization, the normalized abnormalities of my abusive environment, my toxic white Southern culture, is now the source of that anger, vitriol, judgment, and scorn. I don't have to see others as the enemy when I can look around at my own and see the truest evil this country has ever had to face. All I have to do is go outside anywhere in the South or anywhere in rural America. Hell, it's in the cities too. Anywhere there's uneducated people with a chip on their shoulder and someone else to blame for all their woes, you will find this sociopathic narcissism that is tied right to this country's original sin. They're all around us. How do you fix them? How do you protect yourself from them? Build a wall, a big one. No one wants another civil war, but as we've seen with American culture, the pick a side herd me into a pen mentality on these issues. It's directly affecting them. Foreign wars, for example, makes me worry about what Americans might do if or when a split does come. History is often black and white, or in the case of the United States, blue and gray. The reasons for this might be that history is written by the victors or the oppressors. Except that American history in this regard has been allowed to be told by both sides of the Civil War, neither entirely accurate. Across this very round globe, human history is pockmarked with empires overthrown, with insurrections suppressed. What you don't see a lot is the losers being allowed to stay, much less erect monuments for their cause, much less waving their flags of treason so freely, much less altering the reality of history taught to the future generations to lessen the true horrendousness of their actions. History isn't just names and dates and battlegrounds. History is a story, and the history teacher, the storyteller. History comes with more nuance than we can usually imagine or cover in curriculum standards. One must understand the socio-political atmosphere of the time, the geographical significance of the area, the culture, the demographics, the psychographics, and so much more to fully comprehend the gravity of just one simple event. It isn't so much to understand that the state of Franklin only lasted a few years and ended before Tennessee was even a state. It requires a deep understanding of the culture, sociology, economic, and anthropological facts surrounding those people to see how all that impacted the region we now know as East Tennessee, 3/4 of a century before this nation split brother against brother. Just like it always has been, it seems. The United States of America, even then, was blue. While the traitor gray has given way to red these days, we need to be able to clearly identify those whose values align with humanity above all else, and those whose values are awash with the cultism of dehumanization and desensitization, and a sick sense of nationalism. Those people aren't standing with the United States of America. They're fighting against it. They don't want to be united unless we are united under their sociopathic narcissism. Can we learn from the state of Franklin and East Tennessee's self-reliance, resilience, and determination, standing up against the treasonous Confederacy? Hopefully, before the next secession movement. What we can see are some parallels in our current cultural, socioeconomic, and political culture to identify some of the areas in our country which might stand out as those hopeful blue Democratic dots in a sea of blood-red Confederate conservatism. Coming up, in Coo Catch You, I'm deconstructing the attempted overthrows of our country since the Civil War. One you may have never heard of. In the late 1920s, after fat cat capitalists and conservative Republican policies annihilated the American working class, America was ready for a change. By the 1932 election, one man stood to sweep the country and had a lot of corporate America, big banks, and big businesses, big everything in this country, in a panic. After all, they had forced capitalism to crash several times over the previous few decades, so they could sweep in like heroes and save the day. They knew the gravy train was over if FDR was allowed to win the election. They knew he would get the credit for saving America from itself, and then who would be the enemy? What resulted was an attempted insurrection, a coup, an attempted takeover of America's government, militarized takeover by the bankers. We've seen splits, divisions, and fractured factions throughout our nation's brief history. We'll find out more about how those fault lines in our federation have seismically shocked our society repeatedly, fostering a festering, frothing at the mouth faction of fear-mongering fascists ready to dismantle everything America was supposed to be standing for. Democracy, as I'm deconstructing a culture of cultism. Thanks for joining me. My book, Overthinking Everything About You, is available on Amazon, and you can link to it through my website, joshbrandonmedia.com. The Compassion and Critical Thinking Workbook and Influence are both available. Check out some of my other videos on YouTube, all my music TikToks, all of Overthinking Everything, clips of my acting and voiceover work. It's all organized in playlists for your convenience. You can check out my merch store, get your trigger tees in the Sir Talks a Lot, Swags a Lot store. Bumper stickers and more products coming soon too. Follow me on TikTok and everywhere online. Like, share, and subscribe to this video and this channel, and do all the things I need you to do to help me grow. And if you like this series, hey, consider a donation to Cash App. This is my job. And don't forget to sign up for my email list. I'm Josh Brandon, and I'm overthinking everything.